Greetings. This is Dr. Lacey Sloan and Dr. Cathryne Schmitz. We're here to present our paper called Decolonizing Nature, Indigenous Practices for Environmental Sustainability. We're going to be looking at indigenous models of environmental sustainability with examples from around the globe. We all know that climate change is impacting nearly every aspect of our lives. It's impacting our weather, the temperature, flooding, famine, poverty, migration, and conflict. We also know that colonization has contributed to environmental degradation through the extraction and exploitation of natural resources by colonizers and other practices. Some of the impacts of colonization on the environment include contamination of the land, the water, the air. You see here photos of the aftermath of mining, the contamination left behind, the environmental degradation. We are now in a time known as the sixth mass extinction of species, caused primarily by human degradation of the environment, and we are permanently losing 200 species a day right now. We have finally recognized that prior to colonization, there were local and indigenous worldviews that recognized humans were part of the greater ecology and that it's all interconnected and that balance is required. So we're going to provide some quick examples of various ways that local and indigenous knowledge and practices have been used for environmental sustainability. In 2019, when Australia was having, bushfires that were devastating millions of acres of land, they found that areas that had used indigenous cultural burns were protected from the worst devastation. And so now Australia is looking at ways to teach this indigenous practice of cultural burns to others so that it can be used to get rid of fire hazards, discourage invasive species, and also supporting the regrowth of native species. In Pakistan, they are using indigenous agricultural practices going back to the soft tillage, in other words, using oxen rather than machines, using reciprocal communal labor where people come together and help when it's time to plant the crops and harvest them, and also keeping their animals with where they are growing crops so that the fresh manure can be used instead of chemicals and fertilizers. Somaliland became an autonomous country in 1991, and they engaged in a long traditional peace process that ended up resulting in agreements with the pastoralists around the use of the land to protect vulnerable grasslands from overgrazing. They also recognized that economic diversity would protect the environment, so they have invested in finding alternative sources of income, particularly for women, and they've also gone to using permaculture and bunding in order to keep moisture in the land and the plants, bring the plants back to the land. Dr. Wangari Maathai began the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, which is well known as a means of addressing environmental degradation, gender depression, and violent conflict. Dr. Maathai organized women and used indigenous knowledge, civic dialogue, and critical assessment and community empowerment in order to germinate, grow, and replant trees. They also were able to organize against repressive government and protect a park in Nairobi, and their activism has continued to empower women and other people around the country. In Brazil, as we have watched the rainforest be devastated by commercial industry, we know that the Amazonians have managed the forest for thousands of years. And so those practices are being reintroduce the practices of, again, cultural burning and protecting the old growth forests, as well as collecting seeds to replant in the deforested areas. And there are also women leading projects that support a sustainable harvest of non-timber products so that the forests are left standing strong. In the U.S., the traditional indigenous practices of growing the three sisters together, corn, beans, and squash, created a polyculture that protected the soil and controlled pests. And there were alternative ways of doing that, depending on whether it was wet or it was dry. In the U.S., they also use understory fires beneath acorn trees to remove weevil and moth nuts prior to the full harvest. And then mushrooms and huckleberries can be harvested in the same space. In Greenland, local and indigenous communities are most impacted, as they are around the world, from climate change. And there are several practices that are being used or encouraged. For example, the use of dog sleds rather than snowmobiles. Snowmobiles are seen as being very damaging to the environment. Also trying to increase the amount of basically caribou hunting licenses available to local and indigenous peoples, because they don't overhunt an area. They have an area that they hunt in, and other hunters do not. And also reviving the old tradition of reusing waste materials. In Mexico, indigenous practices of terracing has been highly effective in helping keep moisture on marginal lands. It helps reduce erosion and reduces runoff. And they also do intercropping using a system of growing different crops together. And they also use a capital system, which is a system of shade growing, often used in coffee production. In Canada, where colonization had brought miners and the military in that left massive environmental degradation behind, Indigenous and tribal leaders came together to form the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council to protect the Yukon River and heal it from the damage that had happened. And they begin with traditional storytelling and processes to understand how they would move forward. They begin in ceremony, and as they went down the river, they sang and they drummed so that they could share these practices with traditional communities along the river. The forests of Madagascar have always been important to local and indigenous people, and there are many sacred forests that are believed to be where royal ancestors live and lie, and also where there are medicine from plants, and they have been protected for centuries from being felled. And local and indigenous people have been instrumental in helping to select trees, to replant, identify the right time for seed collection, and now they are developing and caring for trees that can be replanted to protect their cultural and social life. India also has sacred groves that are protected because of religious beliefs, and therefore there are over 13,000 sacred groves in India. Other indigenous and local practices include a process called shifting cultivation of crops. This was actually once frowned upon, but now has been shown to be useful to protecting and making the land usable for long periods of time. They cut down the forests, they burn the biomass, and then the ashes are spread in the fields. They only cultivate the field for 1 year, and then they let it sit for years, sometimes a decade. But this has actually been found that this does help retain horticultural and agricultural diversity. And that is our presentation. My understanding is that we will have an opportunity at the end of the session for questions and answers. Thank you.